Like many of you, I suppose, I've spent a good portion of the last 400 some days since November 8th, 2016 in a maelstrom of shock and horror and mystification, trying to keep an eye cocked at the same time for candles being lit. And I'll get to the hopeful part later. But I think before I get to the hopeful part, I think it's important to explore the shock and the horror, and to do our utmost to understand what happened and to try to find meaning in it. We can't, I think, find prettiness in it or joy in it, but we at least ought to make ourselves capable of understanding it. Now, in one way, what happened is like a lot of history. I'm going to interrupt myself here. Is there a bottle of water anywhere in the vicinity? I should have thought of it before I came in. Okay, thanks. Now, in one way, what happened is like a lot of history, in my view, unfathomable. For this unimaginable incumbent, this quintessence of everything deplorable in American life and history, to have climbed to the summit of American power, as he did, this staggering development, was only possible because a dozen or two factors had to break for him, and they all had to break for him. When I was a kid, the baseball announcers used to say, I don't know if they still say that, baseball is a game of inches. They still say that?
Yes, they did. That's water, that's seltzer.
Thanks. Well, politics is also. Or actually, we might say it's a game of 77,000 votes out of about 128 million, which is, by my rough calculation, about 0.06%. So the dreadful story of 2016 is in a way a story of accidents, which is hard to make sense of. It's hard to grasp. It's a story of a chain of bad luck, or bad karma, or plain stupidity, or one damn thing after another. Defeat, as I think no one has said, has 1,000 mothers. So, just to review a few, not in the spirit of acrimony or grudge bearing, but in the spirit of learning from history. So let's consider, for example, bad decisions made by the Clinton campaign, including, not least, and deserving of much more attention than it's gotten, the assigning of key decisions in that campaign to so-called data analysts whose knowledge of on-the-ground politics is about as impressive as my knowledge of astrophysics, which is to say, nil. I don't know if you're aware, probably many people in this room are aware, that the vote that went to Jill Stein in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania was greater than the Trump margin in each state. Very bad not to take seriously what people on the ground in the campaign were asking from headquarters in Brooklyn. I have been, since the election, frequently in contact with the mayor of Madison, Wisconsin, Paul Soglin, who's a contemporary of Steve's and mine, and who's planning to run for governor, I'm glad to say, against Scott Walker. So he was the mayor of the urban area in Wisconsin that delivers normally as big a Democratic margin in the state as the urban area of Milwaukee, although Milwaukee is twice the size. And yet the Clinton campaign refused to take his calls. Malpractice. We could go on about egregious facts. Perhaps most egregious of all, of course, James Comey's reopening the email question in the closing days of the campaign. Suppose Huma Abedin hadn't used Anthony Weiner's laptop for email backup. Suppose Anthony Weiner had exerted some self-control. And so on, and so on. Well, we could go on all that way all night. But to retell this miserable tale, and I'm only sampling a few particulars, to retell this miserable tale would be a shallow way to spend an evening, because what's happened to us, and this is the important point, is a story of institutional failure and breakdown. It's a story of vulnerable and decrepit institutions that failed the ultimate stress test. We sentimentalists, I sometimes include myself in this crowd, we sentimentalists speak of our democracy. But let's face it, it's at most a semi-democracy with pretensions. Our vulnerability to plutocratic takeover has been manifest for many years. I'll have reference to say a few more words in a moment about the election of 2000. It should have been obvious that a democracy is nothing without vigilant institutions of self-protection, and that chief among these must be the courts, the press, and popular mobilization when that mobilization is translated onto the ballot. If we think back to the period 50 years ago when so much progress was made in America toward civil rights, the courage and commitment and resolve of the civil rights movement itself was critical to all this. But without the courts, the press, it would not have been able to accomplish what it did. So even social movements which are happening outside the bounds of ordinary institutions are reliant upon the cavalry, if you will, coming to the rescue. So how are some of our institutions doing now? Well, day by day, the courts show up. I'm glad to say they just showed up in a redistricting case in North Carolina, which may well be pivotal in the coming years. The press, much of it, has eventually discovered that it has a mission. And the popular mobilization is real. I'll come back to that. But before I come back to that, I want to retrace some of the recent history of the media and journalism in bringing us to this past. Because what happened is the emergence of the crooked real estate tycoon with the family subsidy and away with bullshit as a significant figure in American life must be laid at the door of the press. I say press, media. The media poisoned our cultural waters. It's a long story to be told. If any of you are interested, I can provide some details. Suffice to say that for more than 30 years, Donald Trump existed in a state of symbiosis with the media. He was his own press agent. He was their source. They hung on his calls, offering them gossip, often enough about himself. I spoke with a reporter who was working at page 6 on the Post at the time when that famous headline emerged. Some of you may remember it. Best sex I ever had. In quotation marks. It was a quotation. So, this is not something that somebody said to a reporter. This is something reported to a reporter by Donald Trump, speaking in the voice of Marla Maples, his second wife-to-be. This symbiosis was mutually beneficial. It was a mutual aid society. Trump got exposure, and the media got readers. He was a genuinely popular figure in New York City, even before Howard Stern amplified him, even before Jeff Zucker, now of CNN, formerly of NBC, in his wisdom, decided that America needed a reality show starring a fake tycoon. And he was a presence within media from the moment he began lying about the place of Barack Obama's birth. And there were dreadful moments in the early months of the 2016 campaign when the very fact that Donald Trump was running for president was so riveting a fact in the eyes of the news gatekeepers that they would set up cameras before his rallies, long before he had arrived, because the gathering of the crowd was, in their view, a sure route to eyeballs, to the business they have of packaging audiences and creating a sense of spectacle on the basis of which advertising can be sold. So here, this grotesque and unscrupulous racketeer with a long history of engagement with organized crime, with a long history of violation of laws of New York and New Jersey, permitting him to own and operate casinos when by the rules on the books he should not have been permitted to do so. His well-known habit of borrowing money illicitly from his father, he's the self-made billionaire, in order to cover losses at his casinos. This man, this racketeer, this Russian stooge of decades standing, this incarnation of all the worst qualities, I think I'm within my rights to say all the worst qualities of American wealth and toxic masculinity. All of this man long ago struck a bargain with media because they scratched each other's backs. A mutual dependency, or perhaps more in the spirit of our age, a mutual masturbation. And it continued into the campaign. Meanwhile, as many studies have demonstrated, the primary news that came out of the 2016 campaign about Hillary Clinton was emails. That was the main thing about which voters heard from the legions of journalists assigned to cover her. But again, as egregious as this was, this practice of stepping into the democratic arena with the bravado supplied by the First Amendment and declaring itself to be the adjudicator of value, declaring itself to be the tribunes of the people. There's a long history of this. I am someone who will never forget those moments in 2000, on election night 2000, when Tim Russert, often lionized as the epitome of professional journalism, insisted on the air that it would be the better part of valor, grace, for Al Gore to cede victory in Florida. He was on 3 networks that day. I happened to see his 3 performances on NBC, MSNBC, and CNBC. And on each of them, he was saying, wouldn't it be a proper American way to settle this for Al Gore to acknowledge that he's the loser? So that going into that astounding period we will, with dread, remember, when Florida was up for grabs. The going-in assumption, even of the liberal media, was that George Bush was the presumptive victor, and Al Gore was a lunkhead. Now, the press, of course, does not operate in a vacuum. And I think to take the deepest look at the situation we're in, it's essential to this god-awful farce that we're saddled with we have the disadvantage of having been the first democracy, or first republic, perhaps, first republic. And because we were first, we are saddled with an 18th century constitution and 19th century anti-democratic practices. Think about this. The Electoral College has, for 2 elections out of the last 5, favored the loser of the popular vote. 2 out of the last 3 presidents lost the popular vote. Let me say that again. 2 out of the last 3 presidents lost the popular vote. About that, there is no dispute. The political system is a disgrace in so many ways. The difficulty in registering, the insistence on the scrutiny of identification, the closing of polls when convenient for the power holders, the refusal to implement automatic registration, the very holding of elections on a Tuesday. Do you know how that came about? It's quite unknown in other democracies. The usual thing is a weekend. I happened to be in France during a presidential election 20 some odd years ago. The polls are open Saturday and Sunday. Do you know how it got to be Tuesday here? America in 1845, which is when this principle was enshrined, was a farming society. And farmers often needed a full day to travel by horse-drawn vehicles to the county seat to vote. So why Tuesday? Well, it wouldn't interfere with the biblical Sabbath or with Wednesday, which was traditionally market day. So Tuesday was a default throw-in, and it is still our practice. I don't know if there's another country in the world that votes on Tuesdays. So I said I was going to look for lit candles, and I'm pivoting toward that moment. The political energy of the young that's been manifest in the course of the last months. This is a great thing. And it is such a great thing that we had led ourselves to believe that the victory of Barack Obama in 2008 set a precedent. But it remains true, and now I'm going to quote from Tina Rosenberg, who wrote this up recently for the Times, that older, wealthier, and more educated people still turn out in large numbers. Last year, 70% of those over 70 years old voted. Not that I have anything against 70-year-olds voting. By contrast, under 25s voted at a rate of 43%. Barack Obama's first election in 2008 was a high turnout year, and just 6 years later, in 2014, turnout was the lowest it had been since 1942. The youth vote, which spiked up for Obama, spiked right back down in the midterm elections. And even in 2018, as we all know, the turnout factors, pro-turnout factors, including the widespread loathing of the man in the White House, will be undercut by all kinds of structural barriers, which are all designed to preserve the dominance of wealthier, whiter, older people by suppressing the votes of poorer people and minorities. This is not by accident. This is by policy. The development of restrictions on voting has been a central element of the Republican offensive for years. I once wrote that, and again, 20 some odd years ago, that it was a tragedy that while the campus left was marching on the English department for one demand or another, the Republicans were taking over Washington. Well, it was worse than that. While the campus left was marching on the English department, the right was not only marching on Washington, it was marching on the state houses. And so it has come to pass, with no small infusion of plutocratic funds from the Koch brothers and company, and with no small support from the Citizens United and other campaign funding decisions by the courts, Republican courts, that now in more than 30 states, I think it's the last number I saw was 33, the governors and the legislatures are Republican. They are the vote restrictors. They manufactured the fraud of so-called voter fraud. They have implemented the vote, the cancellation of the vote of felons. Where it is written that a person convicted of a crime should be deprived of the prerogatives of citizenship as if they are a privilege rather than an essential right of the republic, I do not know. But you will remember, who can forget how many, by one count, 1.5 million felons struck, or people thought to be felons, or people whose names were the same as felons, or those thought to be felons, stricken from the books under the vote purge under, what was the name of that governor of Florida? Oh yeah, Jeb Bush. I won't go on in any detail about the redistricting matters that are coming to the fore. My favorite horror story has to do with our neighboring state of Pennsylvania. In recent years, with particular in since the new redistricting map was orchestrated in the state of Pennsylvania, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, sorry, Republicans and Democrats have pretty well split the statewide congressional vote. But of the 18 seats that Pennsylvania is entitled to in Congress, in the House of Representatives, 13 were held by Republicans. Take a look at the Republican congressional map sometime. If you want a shock to your system. Monkeys throwing darts could not devise a system of districting so diabolical as what the Republicans did. And they've done it, of course, in many other places. So, I want to come back in a moment to what the campuses have and have not accomplished, but I just want to mention here that I also view it as an almost laughable tragedy of our time, that many of the most vigorous of the students on campuses who affect an adherence to progressive values believe that the most effective thing they can do to fight racism is to shake their fists at a right-wing provocateur. But it would never occur to them to register voters in underregistered, underperforming sectors of the society where the votes would count. That is a very serious default. So the story that I'm telling here is in part a story of Republican ingenuity, devotion, money, seriousness, and it's in part a story of a Democratic / liberal / progressive, what have you, default. A default that did not have time for the hard work of politics, for the hard work, the phone banking, the knocking on doors, the showing up, the taking politics seriously. This is, I think, a travesty. So, what follows? Well, it is a very important thing that we have this resistance. And I must say it's been more forthcoming and conspicuous and impressive than I expected. It has cropped up everywhere. I don't know how many of you have used the Indivisible website, but if you go to their website, indivisibleguide.com or .org, you type in any zip code and they'll tell you about the groups that are meeting within 50 miles of your zip code. And these groups are from hearsay. There's not much solid research on it, but by hearsay, many of these are people who are new. Some of them are Republicans. Some of them are people who were simply aghast at every day's lies coming out of the White House. And they're out there. And it's partly for that reason. And they're out there and they've been mobilizing. They succeeded in driving back the appalling health care so-called Reform Act by showing up at town halls and clamoring to be heard, so that in one marvelous moment, a video camera in Colorado caught the spectacle of a Republican congressman fleeing his own town hall meeting out the back door in order to get away from 150 angry people, many of whom were suffering from illnesses that would no longer be covered under these so-called reform. And that was a victory. And in part because of those pressures, as we read every day, Republicans are deserting the House in droves. Today's victory for democracy will be the disappearance of Darrell Issa of California from political life. I think the resistance spirit has also entered into many of the deliberations of state houses. The state of Washington just passed an omnibus voting reform bill that permits same-day registration. It permits automatic registration. It permits something they call pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. I haven't quite understood how that works out, but it sounds like a good thing. And it's also true that in a number of states, the campaigns to reverse voter restriction are kicking in. It has been made abundantly clear to state legislators and governors that the restriction of the vote is an absolutely unacceptable expedient in a society that proclaims itself to be democratic. I think that we have, if we can mobilize them, numbers. We have to find the serious people and put them to work, registering voters, taking advantage, even in states that have passed voting restriction laws that have not yet taken effect. Take advantage of the fact that those laws have not yet taken effect. Go to work registering voters on the 2 Republican districts on Long Island. New York 19, which you already heard about, which is a winnable district. And there are others within, a few hours' drive of New York. And I would also say, as somebody who spends much of his time on a campus, The campuses need you. They need serious people. They need people who understand the work that should be done. Go to the campuses and mobilize them, because they have lost sight of you. They have lost sight of people who live outside the closed precinct of the university. In their panic, their ignorance, we could spend a long time trying to understand what's gone wrong there. They have foregone the opportunity to be the ongoing armies of a renewed democracy. They are too busy seeking safe spaces for themselves. Do not seek safe spaces. Seek brave spaces. Excuse me. Excuse me. May I finish? May I finish?
Yes, please. Well, would you please hold your microphone to your mouth so I can understand you?
I am delighted.
You're gesturing with the microphone, just traveling all around the place all the time. Make it hopefully understand.
I was delighted to hear that some of you are working to turn votes in the 19th district. I don't know what's going to happen any more than anybody here does. Anybody who thought they knew what was happening over the last year and a half is a wiser or more clueless person than I, because I haven't seen anything coming. So don't take for granted that we have some sort of demographic destiny to win. Many people have been promoting in recent years the notion that as America becomes less white, that it's destined to become democratic. Well, destiny has a way of retreating, going into hiding, waiting its time. There is no destiny. There's only work. So, you've all heard the cliche that this is the most important election we've ever faced, the most important election of our time. It's a cliche because it's true. It always is, and will be forevermore, in a world as bristling with danger and obscenity as this is. So the work you are doing and the work that your peers are doing is indispensable. And we should be so lucky as to be here in a year reviewing what we did so well. Thank you.